The world holds Adolf Hitler to account for the rearmament program which allowed Germany to precipitate the Second World War. To a large extent, this is certainly true. It was Hitler who gave the priority and impetus to develop the drive for the military power which was unleashed upon the unwary nations of Europe in 1939. But Hitler only came to power in 1933, and by that time, the German army was already a long way towards rebuilding the armed forces which Germany had been denied by the harsh conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, imposed after her defeat in World War I. The Versailles Treaty specifically forbade Germany from developing armored cars, tanks, or any other form of tracked armored vehicles. It was designed to leave the field clear for the Allies to continue the development of the descendants of these French light tanks, which had shown promise in the closing months of the Great War.
Well, basically the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, which blames Germany in its entirety for the outbreak of World War I, forbade the German army to use tanks in any capacity whatsoever. However, in the late 1920s, the German army, fully conscious of the increasing technological sophistication and usefulness of tanks, got round the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles by striking a bargain with the Soviet Union. Germany and the Soviet Union were both, in many respects, the pariahs of the international community of the late 1920s. The Soviet Red Army wished to tap into the military expertise of the German army. At the same time, the German army wanted to be able to use Soviet tanks at the Soviet Tank School in Kazan, out of sight of the prying eyes of the Western powers, namely France and Great Britain.
The secret German-Soviet experimental station took the first steps in the development of modern battle tanks. These tanks would later equip the Panzer Divisions of World War II. Ironically, they would be pitched against the Soviet Union as their greatest foe. Two tanks eventually emerged from this clandestine development program. Firstly, there was the tiny Panzer I, a small, lightly armed and armored machine designed as a training and command vehicle. It was armed with 2 machine guns and had space for a crew of just 2 men. Slightly more impressive was the prototype for what would become the Panzer II. The Panzer II was a light reconnaissance tank. It was only marginally more efficient than the Panzer I, but it did at least have a 20mm gun in its turret.
The Panzer I had been designed as the first German tank in the early 1930s, and as such it had actually been designed as a training tank only, and thus it really had never been envisaged as a battle tank. And you can see this from the fact it was only armed with 2 machine guns and had very light armour. So really the Panzer I was not an effective battle tank at all. The Panzer II was in some ways a transitional design and was slightly more battle-worthy than a Panzer I. It had a 20mm cannon and better armour protection. But it really can only be seen as a reconnaissance tank or a light tank and really couldn't match either the firepower or the armour of most Allied tanks.
When Hitler came to unfettered power in 1933, these 2 tanks unexpectedly had to be used to equip the new Panzer Divisions for frontline service. Thanks to Hitler, the next war would arrive far sooner than the generals could have imagined in their worst nightmares. Adolf Hitler was a driven man. He did not intend to heed the pleas of the High Command, who knew that a modern war would need the next generation of medium and heavy tanks, which were then still in development. They would not be ready in numbers before 1940, and a protracted war without them was unthinkable. But a long war was exactly the opposite of what Adolf Hitler had in mind. In the next war, he was determined that Germany would not be brought to her knees by a long, drawn-out war of attrition. It was unthinkable that the horrors of the trenches should ever be repeated, so future campaigns would need to be swift and decisive. In this, at least, he had the support of some sections of the High Command, who agreed that mechanization was the answer.
The Reichswehr, the German army, had been collaborating with the Russians secretly during the 1920s and the early part of the 1930s, and it was there in Russia, and certainly not in England or in Great Britain, that the Germans saw, for example, for the first time, the organization of the first large-scale mechanized brigade, then a mechanized division, and finally a mechanized corps. And the other thing the Germans were able to do was actually to exercise with their tanks, which was not possible elsewhere because of the Treaty of Versailles.
In parallel with the development of the first tanks came the new tactical doctrine which would transform the face of warfare, Blitzkrieg. In the 20s and 30s, Germany developed a new approach to battlefield tactics. During the Great War, the attacking frontage of the armies during major offensives could be as wide as 60 miles. Even the successful Kaiserschlacht offensives, launched by Germany during the last year of the war, saw the troops deployed over a 20-mile-long attack sector. Using blitzkrieg tactics, the new armored forces were to be concentrated together for a single thrust through a very narrow sector of the front. Once they had broken through the opposing front lines, the panzers were instructed to keep going further and further into the enemy rear areas, spreading panic and confusion. The new tank forces were to be supported by a force of dive bombers to spread fear and panic both at the point of penetration, then further into the rear areas as the tanks advanced. To further facilitate the new tactics, the old infantry divisions were augmented by a new formation called a Panzer Division. These divisions had their own tanks, motorized infantry, motorized artillery, and full support and logistics. It was designed to be a highly mobile miniature army, capable of supporting itself on the move.
The reason the Panzer Division was such an effective fighting formation was due to the combined arms element contained within it. A Panzer Division contained, yes, it had tanks, but it also contained a brigade of infantry, anti-aircraft guns, artillery pieces, its own supply columns, and this whole unit was glued together, you might say, with modern voice radio communications. This made it a very flexible formation, and given the fact that the entire formation was motorized, it meant it was a very fast formation.
Blitzkrieg evolved from a reassessment of war tactics that took place not only in Germany, but in Russia and Britain as well. Two perceptive British military theorists, Major General J.C. Fuller and Captain B. Liddell Hart, understood that the introduction of the tank during World War I had opened up hitherto undreamt of military possibilities.
Both Liddell Hart and Fuller, in their writings, they described the kind of battle which they had in mind as the play of lightning. And the German word for lightning is Blitz, of course. So that was taken up when considering that. The first time that the term Panzer Army, Panzer Division was used by an Austrian general called General Eimansberger. And some of Hitler's remarks, his own remarks, about 1936, he's tending to use the word Blitz with respect to war, and then you get the combination of Blitzkrieg. So it slipped in, if you like, into military parlance and general usage around about the mid-1930s.
There are a number of claimants to the title of the father of Blitzkrieg. It is generally accepted that Liddell, Hart and Fuller's experiments with the British tank were important, but at the same time the Germans had worked on the application of motorization and tanks in breakthrough battles. Many of these new ideas came from the work of General Heinz Guderian. A man of acute and perceptive intelligence, Guderian had devoted much thought to the question of how tanks might best be used in a modern battle. Plans and tactics were tried out in war games and maneuvers, which soon convinced Hitler that he had discovered the way to make his dreams of conquest become a reality.
Guderian was a great publicist of the tank. He wrote a very famous book called Achtung Panzer, which was, if you like, required reading for all the practitioners of tank warfare and what later came to be known as the Blitzkrieg. So from the point of view of being, I think, both the protagonist and the publicist of the tank, of the armoured fighting vehicle, and also of the initial concepts of the Blitzkrieg, Guderian plays a very important part indeed.
During the Great War, Guderian had worked extensively with wireless and gained invaluable experience in the deployment of infantry, artillery, and aircraft. With the addition of the tanks, Guderian had a clear vision of the force he wished to create. His tanks would be solely concentrated in the Panzer and Panzer Grenadiers armoured divisions, not dispersed in small numbers throughout the army. They would be spearheads of a single, large military formation, which also included aircraft, artillery, and mechanized infantry. Crucially, the commanders of these new formations would not be stationed far in the rear, but would operate near the front, moving forward with the panzers and responding instantly to changing situations and issuing orders by wireless directly to his units. Making the most efficient use possible of available technology was only part of Guderian's work. He also had a clear understanding of the value of proper training, and that it was vital to encourage drive and initiative, even in the lowest ranks. The German army as a whole had incomparable standards. The men of the tank arm were trained to an even higher pitch and expected to make decisions in action, rather than simply waiting for orders. With this new system at his fingertips, Hitler would plunge Europe into years of barbarity and turmoil on an unprecedented scale. In early 1939, Germany's rearmament was still far from complete. But Hitler knew if he delayed his plans any longer, Germany's enemies might yet grow too strong for her. To be successful, he needed easy, quick, and decisive victories. Because the new Panzer IIIs and IVs were only available in small quantities, he pressed the Panzer I and II tanks into service. But even then, the numbers were far from adequate. At this uncertain juncture, Hitler had a stroke of luck. When Germany annexed Bohemia and Moravia in 1938, it was found that the tanks produced in Czechoslovakia by Skoda and CKD were available in sufficient numbers to bolster the numbers of the Panzer Divisions.
I think it's true to say that in May 1938 there was a genuine danger of war. The Czechoslovak armed forces were properly mobilized, and threats which appeared to have been realistic threats were made by the British and the French in particular that seemed to have deterred Adolf Hitler from ordering the commencement of the operation. In September 1938, however, it appears, as one author has remarked, that the British and French, having looked over the precipice and seen the possibility of war, decided, for reasons to do with their unpreparedness, not to make the same threats that they made in May 1938. And this led, of course, to the rather disastrous agreement made at Munich, and indeed precipitated, many historians argue, the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939.
The Czech light tank, the LT-35, was renamed the Panzer 35T and served alongside their Panzer I and II tanks in the light companies, where it outperformed its German counterparts. Of even greater use was the LT-38 light medium tank, which was now taken into German service and renamed as the Panzer 38T. Better still, almost 220 of the 35T and 60 of the 38T tanks were immediately available. With this windfall addition to his tank forces, Hitler was able to carry out his attack on Poland with greater confidence.
The Czech tanks, the Panzer 35 and 38T, were very, very important to the German war effort in 1940. Over a third of the German tanks used in the campaign in France were in fact Czech tanks, which had been seized by the Germans after the annexation of Czechoslovakia in 38 and 39. Panzer 35T, was a fairly old design, but relatively battle-worthy. The Panzer 38T, on the other hand, was an extremely effective light tank in 1940 and gave much more fighting power to the Panzer Divisions than either the Panzer Is or IIs. The Germans liked the design so much that, in fact, the Panzer 38T, although it was replaced as a battle tank after 1940 and 41, it remained in production until 1945 and was used as the basis for many German fighting vehicles.
Although the Polish campaign was predominantly a conventional war of encirclement, the German battle plan did include some elements of what was to become standard Blitzkrieg doctrine. In the case of Poland, Hitler made no declaration of war. This flagrant disregard for the usual rules of war caught his victims off guard every time he used the same ploy. It gave him the vital advantage of surprise and kept the initiative, which was so vital to the success of Blitzkrieg. What we now understand as the classic forms of Blitzkrieg was rehearsed against Poland in September 1939 by 26 German infantry divisions, 6 panzer divisions, and 4 light divisions, and 4 motorized divisions. The most important supporting element was, of course, the Luftwaffe. In the initial stages of the attack, the Luftwaffe pounded the Polish defenses and destroyed the Polish Air Force on the ground. Even more importantly, it wreaked havoc with Polish mobilization. The cooperation between air and ground, which became an essential element of the Blitzkrieg technique, was perfected in Poland. Although brilliantly conceived and executed, the overall German strategy was still largely based on the classic German tradition of encirclement and envelopment, which could be carried out by conventional forces, but with the strong influence of the Blitzkrieg elements. By the 16th day of the campaign, Poland's situation was already beyond hope. Endeavoring to hold a thin and overextended front of 2,000 kilometers, the Poles fought with selfless bravery. Even in 1939, the elite of the old-fashioned Polish army was considered to be the mounted cavalry. Galloping fearlessly across the battlefield like ghosts from a lost age, these cavalrymen were committed to the impossible task of charging the German tanks with their lances and sabers. In Germany, there was jubilation and a sense of restored national pride. The nation's virile leader acquired new prestige and laurels from the fatherland, and the Third Reich sensed that it was entering into a glorious new world of its own making. When Hitler visited the Tank Corps soon after the invasion, it was the achievements of the Panzer Divisions that delighted him most. In return for his huge success, Guderian had lost only 150 men and 700 wounded. The Blitzkrieg elements were falling smoothly into place. The success of the Polish campaign fired Hitler's pride, aggression, and vanity. In the late spring of 1940, it also gave him the confidence for the successful military conquests of Denmark and Norway. By May of that year, Hitler was ready for his greatest gamble to date, the invasion of France. Case Yellow had been repeatedly postponed. The delays, however, were put to good use, and the intensive study of the lessons from the Polish campaign were undertaken. The role of the armoured divisions and the other Blitzkrieg components came under particular scrutiny. One of the men eager to discover what improvements could be introduced was Heinz Guderian, one of Hitler's most capable generals. In the short Polish campaign, the Germans had lost a disproportionately high number of the vulnerable Panzer I and II tanks, which accounted for 172 losses from a total of 217. This was clearly cause for concern, but the flow of replacements was beginning to speed up. With the German and Czech works at full stretch, Guderian now had a larger, far more modern tank force. Crucially, the new Mark III and IV tanks were available in good numbers, and the first full-scale experiment in Blitzkrieg tactics could begin. It was to lead to the fall of France. Early in the morning of the 10th of May 1940, Fall Gelb was activated. German forces swung down into the Low Countries, and the term Blitzkrieg was burned into the pages of history. Despite the increase in the number of German tanks, the French still enjoyed a great superiority in military material. The French Air Force was bigger than the German Air Force, and had it been properly deployed, it could easily have blunted the German invasion sufficiently for the Germans to run out of fuel. The huge number of tanks and support vehicles in the Panzer Divisions consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and the Germans knew that the backup to that first Blitzkrieg thrust would be stretched to its limit. The generals also knew that if they were held at bay for even a couple of weeks, they would run out of both fuel and ammunition.
Fuel, and not just fuel, but oils and all the kinds of lubricants which motorised vehicles need, were absolutely essential for armoured divisions and mechanised divisions in the Second World War. Without them, they simply could not go anywhere. One example of this came from the 1940 campaign in France, when French tanks, particularly the Char B, which actually ran on aviation fuel, kept running out of fuel before they could reach the battlefield and had to be constantly refueled. The Germans, on the other hand, using petrol for their engines, were able to actually pull up at French petrol stations and refill their tanks that way. So improvisation could be used to keep an armoured division on the go in certain circumstances, but in other campaigns, such as the desert campaigns or in Russia, fuel could become very short very quickly, and it needed a great deal of logistic planning to enable armoured divisions to continue to advance.
Setting aside the supply concerns, the strategy that had eventually been settled upon for the attack was of glittering audacity. A surprise offensive was launched through Holland and Belgium, which it was hoped would draw the British forces northwards away from their French allies, who would hold their defensive positions in the famous Maginot Line. Then, a powerful concentration of German armour would crash through the weakly defended Ardennes region. Without real opposition, this arm of the attack would thrust into France to divide the Allied armies in half. From the outset, the great stratagem worked immaculately, and when Hitler was told, he almost wept for joy. On the 10th day of the campaign, Guderian reached Amiens. The last link between the Allied forces to the north and south was severed, adding still further to the already dire confusion in the chain of command. On the 24th, 4 days later, Hitler issued one of the most controversial orders of the war. For 2 days, he had halted the German tanks outside the town of Dunkirk, where the British army was encircled. This respite prevented a massacre taking place, and the evacuation of the British from Dunkirk was the result.
This decision was taken by Hitler mainly because of the fright given to Rommel's 7th Panzer Division on the 21st of May by a British counterattack at Arras. Combined with that fact, or with that rather frightening episode for the Germans, was the fact that Hitler did not want to waste his Panzer Divisions in heavy street fighting, which was already beginning to develop around Calais. And thus, in some ways, the decision was rational to allow the Air Force to bomb the BEF into submission. It's also important to remember that Hitler really did not believe that the BEF could be saved by sea. He wasn't a naval man and didn't understand what the Royal Navy could actually do.
Because of his love of detail, Hitler demanded daily reports from the front line. From there, it seemed that Hitler had gained the mistaken impression that German tank losses were higher than they actually were. He had, it seems, mistaken the number of broken down vehicles in the report as total losses. He therefore decided to allow the Luftwaffe to finish off the British, while his precious tank forces were saved for the final attack on France. On the 20th of June, after just 6 weeks of war, France agreed to sign a demeaning armistice.
It was a very successful Blitz campaign. Yes, they broke through in the south. They were able to bring great pressure on the Allied armies. They forced the withdrawal of the British Expeditionary Force to Dunkirk. They encircled the French armies. So from that point of view, it was a success. And it was a success for two reasons. A, it was very carefully planned and brilliantly executed. But there, the logistics problem was not so serious. Where the German army came up against logistics problem, as it did in Russia, then the Blitzkrieg didn't work. It was what it was meant to be, a short, sharp, rapid, brutal penetration.
Hitler was overjoyed at this astounding vindication of the methods of Blitzkrieg. Germany rejoiced with him. The nation's honor had been restored, German prosperity assured by the new order in Europe, and the ignominy of Versailles was lost in the past. Under their revered leader, this transformation had been achieved at a cost far below all expectation. Germany had every reason to thank its armed forces, as the posters exhorted them to do. Hitler was pleased, but not content. He wanted much more. A declaration of war against Yugoslavia and Greece simultaneously was the signal that Blitzkrieg was about to be unleashed again. It burst over Yugoslavia on the 6th of April, 1941. The same day, Belgrade was heavily bombed, and the Germans tore through the country. Zagreb, Sarajevo, and Skopje fell in quick succession, and just 12 days later, Yugoslavia was completely occupied. Greece was now the front line. With the Balkan flank now secured, the unprecedented military build-up in progress all along Germany's eastern borders continued. Hitler had resolved to invade the Soviet Union. This great offensive, codenamed Barbarossa, had been fermenting for a long time in Hitler's mind. Firmly rooted in National Socialist ideology was the conviction that Germany's destiny lay in the east. But Soviet Russia was just too vast to hope that it would fall in 30 days like Poland. Once more, Hitler needed a quick war. Once more, he needed it soon. His gambler's instinct told him that Germany would never stand so strong as she stood then. And if he delayed, even 1 year, the crowds that cheered so fervently might no longer be willing to follow him into so hazardous an adventure. He gambled that the war would last 3 months. It was the biggest and most mistaken assessment of his ramshackle career. The coming war would last almost 4 years and claim 30 million lives. At 0300 hours on the morning of June the 22nd, 1941, the code word Dortmund crackled down the wires. 3 million men stood in battle readiness. The ground along the Russian borders vibrated to the thunder of massed artillery. High above, hundreds of bombers flew steadily eastwards. The theory of Blitzkrieg was about to be tested on a far grander scale than anything yet undertaken, and in an arena of frighteningly vast proportions. The German forces were disposed in 3 great army groups. The topmost, Army Group North, swung away northwards aiming for Leningrad. The 3rd Army Group, known as Army Group South, moved sharply down towards the Ukraine, with the oil fields of the Caucasus as its ultimate goal. Guderian was with the principal German offensive in Army Group Center. Their objectives were Smolensk, and beyond that the industrial and administrative heart of Soviet Russia, Moscow. As usual, the invasion forces scythed through hopelessly disorganized opposition and moved rapidly onwards. The well-honed Blitzkrieg pattern was being repeated, and the Soviet defenses whirled away like chaff in the wind. The number of prisoners taken seemed too immense to be true, but it was. Almost 3 million Russian soldiers fell into German hands in the opening phases of Barbarossa, and the scale of destruction was terrifying. As the news of Barbarossa reverberated around a stunned and disbelieving world, even Germany was awestruck. Despite the successes, Guderian was at odds with the overall plan. He was acutely aware that the one guiding principle of Blitzkrieg, the concentration of maximum force against a single objective, had already been neglected. Even worse, as the army groups advanced, they would diverge away from one another instead of coming closer together in an enveloping movement. In addition, Guderian was not being allowed to develop the technique he had exploited so masterfully in France. A short, sharp campaign which kept a close eye on the practical issues of supply. The Polish campaign took place in 36 days. The campaign in the West lasted 42 days. But the campaign in Russia lasted 1,000 days. In the autumn of 1941, the Blitzkrieg technique was failing. The reasons were the logistical problems which beset the German army as a whole, but were especially severe for the German tank columns. There had always been a fear in the German High Command that the panzers might run out of fuel, or they might run out of ammunition, or that they might outstrip the ability of the army to keep them supplied and in working order. At that point, Germany would become embroiled in a war of attrition with a bigger adversary. This is exactly what happened in Russia, and with that, the Blitzkrieg floundered.
The Soviet Union had relatively few roads. A very small proportion of the roads that existed were paved. This meant that the German army's logistical system, which was heavily dependent upon the roads, was going to face severe problems in sustaining any advance into the interior of the Soviet Union once the weather deteriorated.
Incredible numbers of prisoners had been taken, and huge quantities of tanks and guns captured or destroyed. Despite this sustained progress, Guderian was increasingly conscious of grounds for unease in the development of the campaign. The unending immensity of the land depressed many soldiers. Lack of mobility, particularly of tracked vehicles, was a severe drawback. There continued to be a huge haul of prisoners, but the German pincers were closing too slowly, allowing large numbers of Red Army troops to get away, and the Red Army appeared to command endless reserves. Most roads were of dirt, which with the sudden rains turned quickly to mud, halting entire columns.
The terrain itself was not particularly difficult for the German army to negotiate when the weather was good. But once the weather deteriorated in the autumn and winter of 1941, the nature of the terrain, the forests and the swamps and the poor infrastructure of the Soviet Union ensured that the terrain, the sheer size of the country, would come to work very heavily against the successful advance of the German army.
Meanwhile, Hitler was vacillating. Having failed to annihilate the Red Army, his interest turned towards securing the economic prize of the Ukrainian oil wells. To Guderian's dismay, he was diverted from his plan to drive hard and fast for Moscow and ordered south to the Ukraine. His divisions performed outstandingly, helping to take well over 500,000 prisoners and nearly 1,000 tanks. But the crucial moment had passed. The advance to Moscow was resumed at the end of September, but the delay proved to be fatal. Fuel and supplies were delivered through a system that had become stretched beyond its limit, and the lines of communication were enormously overextended. Shortages of every kind impaired the fighting ability of the frontline forces. The vague fears of the generals who had initially harbored doubts were beginning to take the shape of a massive, impending disaster. The advance had been over areas so vast that it was impossible for comprehensive mopping-up operations to be undertaken. Behind the Germans, there lay the huge expanses of territory in which tens of thousands of Red Army troops roamed uncaptured.
The Blitzkrieg was a very limited technique, and it could not be universally or permanently applied. And when the Blitzkrieg, in a sense, ran out of steam, ran out of capability, then I think Hitler and the German command faced very serious problems.
Blitzkrieg's lifeblood was rapid movement, and the spearheads were now being reduced to a perilously slow crawl. The autumn rains were heavy. In France, there had been proper roads. Here, the highways were vanishing into impassable tracts of mud, in which men, vehicles and horses floundered more and more helplessly. Breakdowns increased, and repairs became extremely difficult to carry out. Guderian had started Barbarossa with 600 tanks. By the middle of November, he was left with just 50 that were operational. As the temperature continued to fall and the unforgiving Russian winter arrived, soldiers now paid dearly for the arrogance that had refused to admit the possibility of anything other than a quick, decisive campaign. Few men had more than summer clothing, and frostbite took an agonizing toll.
Towards the end of October 1941, many German troops were praying for the weather to become colder, because once the roads froze, the ground would harden, and this would enable the German panzers to continue rolling. Nevertheless, most German troops did not anticipate the kind of temperatures they began to encounter in late November 1941. Cold of the magnitude of -20, -25 degrees centigrade completely undermined the ability of the German soldier to fight effectively and the ability of his equipment. Most German tanks, artillery, simply did not have the capacity to withstand temperatures of this kind. In the artillery, recoil systems froze. Some German commanders reported that it took 12 hours of heating simply to thaw out the engine of a German tank. Once the German army stopped moving, it then became involved in positional fighting. Positional and defensive fighting against the Russian formations increased the demand for supplies at a time when the demand for supplies could not be met.
The mighty offensive in Russia had run its course. German armoured divisions lay shattered in the frozen wastes before Moscow, together with Hitler's dreams of glory. The golden days of Blitzkrieg were at an end. An angry Hitler proclaimed himself supreme commander and dismissed many of his highest generals. On Christmas Day 1941, Heinz Guderian was relieved of his command. A shameful way to treat such a committed and successful soldier. Another great soldier who would later be treated even worse by Hitler was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. While Guderian was in disgrace after the failures in the snows of Russia, Rommel had risen to prominence under the beating sun, following a string of remarkable successes in North Africa. The wide open spaces of the North African desert would, at first glance, appear to have been ideal tank country. In practice, much of this huge arena was actually impassable to tracked vehicles. The soft sand of the deep desert was very difficult to negotiate and played havoc with the vehicles, which were essential for desert warfare. The war in the desert was therefore fought on a narrow coastal strip of passable terrain between the desert and the sea. This small area saw the bulk of the fighting, as the campaign in the desert seesawed backwards and forwards between Egypt and Libya. Under Rommel's inspired leadership, the outnumbered German forces were able to achieve some spectacular victories. In many respects, these were classic Blitzkrieg battles, like those in which the Germans had enjoyed such spectacular success during the French campaign. Rommel, of course, had taken part in that campaign, where he had achieved outstanding success as the leader of the 7th Panzer Division, which had gained the nickname the Ghost Division. Rommel applied his experience from France to the desert theatre. Despite the enormous difficulties of a very tenuous supply situation, he was able to record some of the most audacious victories of the war. But in so doing, he did create the opportunities for later critics to question some of the aspects of his famous legacy, and in particular, his habit of leading from the front.
Rommel was much criticized for using one of the most important parts of the Blitzkrieg technique, which was to have the commander very far forward, handling the battle, not from a corps headquarters or a divisional headquarters. He was very much criticized for that, although Rommel, of course, had commanded Panzer Division in 1940. Rommel was the first to break through in the Ardennes and get to the Meuse. So when he is in North Africa, you get, again, virtually classic Blitzkrieg technique adapted to desert warfare conditions. But the essence of that was the command and control system, highly flexible, movable, up with the front, up with the troops, taking account of the situation.
Eventually, even the unexpected victories won by Rommel were overcome by the superior weight of Allied arms ranged against him, and the Africa Corps was finally defeated in 1943. In Russia at that time, the whole course of the war was about to be decided. On the eve of the Battle of Kursk, Hitler knew the moment of decision had arrived. He had little option but to recall Guderian, who was reappointed to the new position of Inspector of the Tank Forces in time for that cataclysmic battle. With Guderian back at the front, Hitler may well have been trying to recapture some of the earlier flair which had produced the successes of 1939 and 1940. He sensed that he was playing his last card on the Russian front. The Battle of Kursk was an all-or-nothing attempt to win the war in Russia. As a gamble, the stakes were enormous, and Hitler was conscious of the benefits which a successful Blitzkrieg campaign had once produced.
There's a justifiable argument to say that the huge German offensive in 1943 at Kursk, which was to bite off and destroy the Red Army's salient, was a Blitzkrieg attack, was a blitz attack in that sense. On the other hand, the Battle of Kursk degenerated into virtually a slugging match, which is what the Blitzkrieg was not supposed to be. It was meant to forestall and indeed to eliminate that kind of battle. And I and some of my colleagues have reservations about describing that battle as a Blitzkrieg attack in that sense.
With the defeat at Kursk, the writing was clearly on the wall for the Wehrmacht. The fears of those generals who had opposed the Blitzkrieg concept in the first place now proved to be hauntingly correct. Even Hitler must now have known that any hope of final victory was gone. Hitler had wanted to avoid a war on two fronts at all costs. He now had a war on three fronts, as the Allies were engaged against the German forces in Italy, France, and Russia. With the exception of the Italian front, which had been stabilized under Kesselring, there was a remorseless stream of bad news from both east and west.
I think it's fair to say it would have taken a miracle for Germany to win in 1944. Certainly on the Eastern Front, Germany no longer held a strategic initiative, and indeed throughout 1944 the Red Army was to inflict a series of massive defeats upon the German army. Perhaps Germany's only chance of prevailing in World War II in 1944 would have been if they had managed to successfully defeat the Allied invasion of Northwest Europe, i.e. D-Day, on the 6th of June 1944. D-Day didn't so much end the war in itself, but it ensured that Germany would be defeated, because Germany was struggling to contain the Red Army on the Eastern Front with 75% of its available resources. What D-Day ensured was that the remaining 25% would have to be diverted towards fighting the other enemy, namely Britain and the United States. This was a task that Germany was simply not capable of.
These terrible psychological blows further damaged Hitler's already paranoid personality and served to further cloud his deranged decision-making ability. In contrast to the strutting peacock of 1940, he had become a complete fantasist and recluse. The effects of the failed attempt by his own officers to take Hitler's life, by the bomb explosion in his headquarters in June 1944, further hampered his ability to make any form of rational decision.
It might be said that the significance of the failed assassination attempt on Hitler is that in some respects it actually increased the war. rather than shortened it, because it brought to power some of the more ideologically fanatical members of the German Reich who ensured that the Allies would have to fight right to the streets of Berlin in order to completely defeat Germany. It therefore completely ruled out the idea of any compromise surrender on Germany's behalf. Germany was going to fight to the death and force its opponents to do so.
One last manifestation of the decline of Hitler's decision-making power was his disastrous decision to mount the ill-fated Ardennes offensive in late 1944. This enormous operation drew on the last reserves of manpower available to the Wehrmacht. There is little doubt that the High Command would have preferred to see these precious forces which were deployed in the Ardennes thrown against the ominous advances of the Red Army. Now he really was clutching at straws, but once again, it seemed Hitler was harking back to the glory days of the Blitzkrieg. Once again, he hoped that a powerful and unexpected thrust through the Ardennes region, which had led to the former victory over France in 1940, would again bring him glory from the jaws of defeat. This time, he was to be disappointed. Desperately short of both fuel and ammunition, the massive German assault was quickly brought to a standstill by the superior Allied ground forces. And equally quickly, it was ground into submission by the ever-present Allied Air Force.
The German attack in 1944, the so-called Ardennes offensive, was meant to be a classic blitzkrieg. And again, it ran out of steam, if you like, for two reasons. It ran out of steam because of logistical problems. And secondly, it ran out not of steam, but was pounded to pieces because it did not have control of the air. Once the weather cleared and the Allied air forces got into action, a key component of the blitzkrieg technique was air control and the kind of air superiority that they needed.
Without control of the air, this last blitzkrieg did not enjoy the remotest possibility of success. Blitzkrieg had been designed as a fast-moving surprise attack. It was not a doctrine which could survive the attritional demands of a long, drawn-out war. Undaunted, Hitler ordered a last offensive in Hungary, but by now the writing was on the wall. There would never again be a successful blitzkrieg attack. Given the depraved regime from which the doctrine sprang, we can all be thankful for that.